Recognize the senator from Arkansas.
Mr. President, it's 2:20 on a Saturday afternoon, not a usual time for the Senate to be in business, especially leading into the August state work period when senators are home meeting with their constituents, hearing their concerns, sharing news about what we've worked on. So you can say it's unusual for sure that we are here. I want to take a brief trip down memory lane to explain why we're here. For the benefit of senators, especially senators who haven't been here until recently, and for the benefit of our friends who are visiting in the gallery. We're here for one reason. We're here because of the actions of one man, Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader. We're here voting, as you've probably seen and wondered about, on a series of nominees. These are not household names. For some of them, you may not even knew the job existed. I'm sure, no offense, I'm sure it's important to them and their parents. But for over 200 years, these kind of nominees didn't get a vote on a procedural question and then 2 hours of debate and then another vote on confirmation. They were voice voted, or they were adopted by what's called unanimous consent of the Senate for over 200 years. You can see the evidence here in front of me in this chart. This is the percentage of civilian nominees who have been confirmed by voice vote or by unanimous consent going back to George Bush 41 and to today, President Trump's second term, through about the first 6 months of the administration. George Bush 41, 98%. Bill Clinton. Some people thought Bill Clinton's presidency started a more polarized politics. Nope, 98% for Bill Clinton as well. George W. Bush, Bush 43. Well, it's a 5x increase in the number of record votes we needed, but still 90%. I would note that Senator Schumer was elected in 1998, so he showed up here about 2 years before George W. Bush did. Obama, despite the treatment of George W. Bush by the Democratic senators, stayed steady at 90%. 90% of all of Barack Obama's nominees through his first 6 months were confirmed by voice vote or unanimous consent. Look at this huge drop here. From 90% for Barack Obama to not even 2/3 for Donald Trump in his first term. And yes, it does decline by another 8% to Joe Biden. As is often said, what goes around comes around. The shoe will be on the other foot, and you might not like how it feels. But look now at the unprecedented break from the customs of the Senate under these Senate Democrats and Chuck Schumer, from 57% to zero. Zero. Not a single one. Not a single nominee of Donald Trump's have been confirmed by voice vote or by unanimous consent in the first 6+ months of his administration. A totally unprecedented blockade. And we're not talking about the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of the Treasury. Again, we're talking about jobs like the Chief Counsel for Advocacy at the SBA. I bet most of you didn't even know that job existed. They do important work, but does the Senate really need to spend 2 hours and 2 votes on it? I would suggest not, based on historical customs. So when did this all start? When did it happen? Did it happen when TV cameras got in the Senate and senators could come down here and perform for the TV camera? No. In fact, there's ample examples and precedent of highly controversial nominations, not even requiring a 60-vote threshold. Think about Clarence Thomas, maybe the best example. Clarence Thomas in 1991, the most consequential nomination we consider, a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court of the United States. One of the most, if not the most, controversial nominees in history because of the lies and calumnies that Democratic senators made against him I would add. He was confirmed on a record vote of 52 to 48. Now you may say, well, how did he get confirmed? He didn't have 60 votes. And that's because as late as 1991, it was considered unprecedented for a senator to require what we call a cloture motion, a motion to end debate at a 60-vote threshold on a nominee, on any nominee, to include a Supreme Court justice. Think about some of the senators who were here in 1991, who could have, on their own accord, irrespective of the wishes of another 99 senators, demanded that Clarence Thomas get 60 votes before he be confirmed. Teddy Kennedy, Robert Byrd, Joe Biden, John Kerry, lions of the Democratic Senate. Not a single one of them came down here and said, I want to demand a 60-vote threshold for Clarence Thomas. Maybe there were conversations about it, but maybe people like Teddy Kennedy and Robert Byrd said, we don't do that. That's not the way things are done here. Until 1999, when Chuck Schumer shows up. And he and other liberals in the Senate and a bunch of liberal law professors begin circulating the idea, no, we should require 60-vote thresholds for nominees. And then a couple years into the Bush administration, they began to demand it, most notably on nominees to the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and most notably of all those, on Miguel Estrada, a young Latino lawyer that they were afraid George Bush was going to later elevate to be the first Latino on the Supreme Court. They took unprecedented actions, and that, led by Chuck Schumer, is what brought us to this moment today. That's one reason why this says 90% and not 98%. By 2013, Harry Reid, then Majority Leader of the Senate, voted to change the rules of the Senate and said there will no longer be 60-vote thresholds on any office other than the Supreme Court. He did it right there at that desk. Mitch McConnell stood at that desk, then the Republican leader, and said, what goes around comes around. The shoe may be on the other foot, and it may be there sooner than you might think. And sure enough, 4 years later, in 2017, Republicans used the Harry Reid precedent and extended it to the Supreme Court. So now Supreme Court nominees, as was the case throughout history, only require a simple majority vote. And then the Democrats engaged in the dilatory practices that they're using now, which is why this number was at 65, to demand 30 hours of debate. And I say 30 hours of debate in air quotes because nobody comes down here in those times and debates the nominee pending on the floor. They talk about climate change, or they recognize someone celebrating their 100th birthday back home, but nobody comes down here and has a serious debate on the merits of a nominee. So in 2019, Republicans used the Harry Reid precedent again to cut the time for debate for most offices in the sub-cabinet, not for courts of appeals, not for cabinet members, not for the Supreme Court, from 30 hours to 2 hours. And that's why we spend 2 hours in between each one of these votes. But Democrats, having lost again last year, the White House and the Senate, have brought us to this point. 0 nominees confirmed by voice vote or by unanimous consent. An unprecedented blockade. All traced back to Chuck Schumer's decision when he got in the Senate to break the norms, the practices, the traditions of the U.S. Senate. Well, this is not going to stand for much longer. It's up to our Democratic friends to decide how they would like to proceed. Do they want to follow Chuck Schumer off the cliff? Because if so, we'll be happy to use the Harry Reid precedent again. We'll eliminate 2 hours of debate time. We'll eliminate motions to go in and out of executive session. We'll eliminate cloture motions entirely for nominees that currently take 2 hours of debate. For today, maybe we'll make a motion to adjourn. And when the House returns and votes on that motion, then Donald Trump can appoint this backlog of more than 150 nominees in a recess appointment. It's the Democrats' choice. They have a third choice. They could return to historical precedent. They could agree to voice vote today, in the next few minutes. More than 150 nominees, at this point, most of whom came out of our committee on a bipartisan basis. Many of whom are nominated to offices that have literally never had a recorded vote on the floor of the United States Senate. The question is up to the Democrats. Do you want to do this the easy way or do you want to do it the hard way? Because Republicans are prepared to finish what Chuck Schumer started 22 years ago. And what it will do is return the U.S. Senate to those practices, customs, and traditions that prevailed here from the 18th century to 2003 for both parties, for presidents of both parties. I think our republic was just fine from the 18th century to 2003. But one way or another, I promise you, this is going to stop. I yield the floor.